Thank you for joining the presentation of the World Development Report 2020 on trading for development in the age of global value chains. Probably Aditya will tell you too, but it's, the bank hasn't written a flagship report like the World Development Report on trade for over 30 years. So last year, when there were discussions within the bank to sort of decide on what could be a good focus for this year's World Development Report, lots of voices went up that maybe it was important to look at trade issues. And particularly from my relatively simple perspective, okay, I should introduce maybe myself first quickly. I'm Jos Verbeek. I'm the manager, special representative to the UN and the WHO for the World Bank here in Geneva. And I'm one of these annoying traditional economists who was brought up that, or went to graduate school. I was also brought up, by the way, by my parents, of course, but went to graduate school at the Tinbergen Institute, very well-known economist, but also very well-known institute in the Netherlands. And that, in a sense, trade was always good for everybody. It was good for for specialization. It was good for growth. It was good for poverty reduction. And I think we now in a situation by which the general public is much less convinced that trade is a good thing. And I think we'll hear Aditya talk about that a bit in much more detail, obviously. Okay, so I want to thank the Graduate Institute Center for Trade and Economic Integration for organizing the event in collaboration with our office here in Geneva. I normally don't like reading stuff out, but when you do introduction of speakers and panelists, you really have to make sure that you get their titles right and their names right, because otherwise they don't recognize it. They think, oh, am I supposed to talk or not? But anyway, it's a real pleasure to have with us, of course, Aditya Mathur. He's the co-director of this year's World Development Report. After this, I think he's moving on. He is becoming chief economist. No, not leaving the bank. I see surprised faces. No, he's not. He's moving on to become the chief economist for East Asia and the Pacific region in the World Bank. That's a very prestigious position because it includes many of the bigger developing countries and many of the countries that are also very much engaged in trade or related to these issues. I can say where he was in the past. He was at the trade organization and others. But Aditya and I go back to 2004, I think, 15 years, when he had just joined the bank. And I just want to tell that little story. When I was responsible for Zambia, so if he brings on Zambia, that's because he did research when I was working on Zambia as what we call leading country economist. Aditya came to me, he says, I really want to do a report in trade and services. And I really think that a landlocked country, a natural resource-rich country, would also be a good example to look at how it can benefit from trade in services. So we did a fantastic report. Aditya deserves, of course, all the credit for it. And after that, his career took off. He became the research manager for trade, and then now co-director, and now, after this, chief economist for the East Asia and Pacific region. We have fantastic discussions today. I'm going to start with Marion. She's the director, Marion Jensen. She's the director of the Division for Market Development and chief economist at the International Trade Center. Actually, the three of them we have here probably don't need any introduction, but I will do it anyway. In this role, Marion oversees ITC's work on trade and market information, export strategy, trade facilitation, and policy for business. As chief economist, she's also the lead on the ITC's flagship publication on SME competitiveness outlook and oversees ITC's contribution to the G20 processes. Mariam is well known in Geneva because she held positions at WTO, and she also worked before that at the ILO. Then we have Richard Baldwin. He needs no introduction, I presume, here at the Graduate Institute, but he's the professor of international economics and editor-in-chief of Fox. He was president of the Center for Economic Policy Research and a visiting professor at Oxford and MIT. Richard advises governments and international organizations, is the author of numerous books. I'm sure he has his own latest book with him, and articles on international trade, globalization, regionalization, and European integration. They haven't taken place here yet because we will have Aditya, of course, during a presentation, and then they want to follow the presentations. And last but certainly not least, we have Damien, and let me get his last name. Grimshaw. Okay, sorry, I couldn't find your name. I only see your first name all of a sudden here. It's on the screen. All right, there you go. And Damien is the director of the research department of the International Labour Organization. Previously, he was Professor of Employment Studies at the Alliance Manchester Business School, University of Manchester, and Director of the European Work and Employment Research Centre. His research interests include the dynamics of low pay, women's position in the labour market, the relationship between institutions and inequalities, and international comparative analysis. I think, Aditya, we got you a very nice set of discussions. I hope you will live up to the expectations that we have raised with the World Development Report. I know you will, because I've seen a few of the presentations already. And please can I invite you up to present the report to us.
Thank you very much, Jos. Thank you very much, Richard, colleagues, everybody, for organizing this event and for inviting us to present. I should tell you all that you have a choice. There's an event next door on the toilet revolution. So if you still want to change your mind and attend that instead of this presentation, I won't be hurt. I think that's much more important than what I'm going to talk about. We all know, thanks to Richard's seminal work, that remarkable improvements in information, communication, and transport technology have made it possible to fragment production across international boundaries. And that has made it possible to develop a new, finer international division of labor, where countries, instead of producing entire products like cars and computers, can specialize in specific parts and tasks. Now, to borrow a line from, or paraphrase Anna Karenina's first line, all countries participate in global value chains, but in different ways. Some of the countries we care most from a development perspective about participate in relatively basic ways. They're located at the base of global value chains, producing commodities and natural resources, everything from cocoa to copper. A relatively few developing countries have broken into more advanced or basic manufacturing or agro-processing industries. You know, when you think of Cambodia or Bangladesh and now Ethiopia, these are countries which are essentially importing cloth to make clothes. A few others are more advanced. Now, Malaysia, Vietnam, and countries in Eastern Europe have moved into progressively more advanced manufacturing and services, often importing electronic components to make into products. And relatively few countries are located at the cutting edge, generating innovation and producing innovative goods and services. The point of this report is to ask, first of all, does it matter how you participate? And second, if it does, what can you do about it? What can you do on your own through national policies? And what can you do acting cooperatively internationally? We think of global value chains essentially as having two key dimensions. One is hyper-specialization. You're not producing or particular entire products. You're going narrower and finer to focus on a particular component or a particular task. Think of it as Adam Smith on steroids. You're really reaping the benefits of economies of scale and specialization. The other dimension is that these transactions are not anonymous transactions in spot markets. These transactions often involve firms in durable relationships, and therefore are often associated with transfers of input, credits, and most of all, technology, in which firms, in a way, have mutual benefit in sharing. We look at what the drivers of this participation are in terms of the fundamentals, what a country has, where it is located, and what institutions it has, as well as the outcomes, the things we care about: output growth, employment, poverty, but also downsides, inequality, Does it hurt the environment? We look at the policies that shape participation as well as the policies that influence outcomes. We are at a particular juncture where what Richard has called the second great unbundling seems to be running out of steam. We saw dramatic growth in the 90s when there were these momentous events like the integration of China into the global economy, of Eastern European countries moving towards open capitalist systems, of the conclusion of the Uruguay round. But subsequently, after the crisis, we are seeing first a flattening and now a decline. There are different reasons why this could be happening. It could be that these value chains are maturing. It could be technology is somehow causing onshoring, as people say. Or it could be that not only has liberalization run out of steam, but we are beginning to see a reversion to protection. And that's an important question where our understanding is still evolving. But you might ask, why do we care? And here, these are our central conclusions of this report. First of all, that if you manage to jump on this train, if you successfully participate in global value chains, and as our colleagues from UNCTAD have reminded me, relatively few countries have succeeded, then you see an increase in incomes, productivity, better jobs, and a reduction in poverty. But you can also see increased inequality, particularly within countries, and adverse effects on the environment. Our conclusion, nevertheless, is that I should tell you that you cannot lean back against this wall. That these global value chains can continue to support development if, one, developing countries undertake deeper reform, and large industrial countries, which is a euphemism for one particular country, continue to follow open and predictable policies. That's even to reach a conclusion like that and speak soft truth to power takes a lot in this world, especially for institutions like the World Bank, which depend on capital contributions from some of the most important countries. But that is really the substance of this report. The rest is detail. Let me now show you some of the evidence. I think one of the contributions of this report, in a way, a lot of it is stuff that you're instinctively familiar with. And in some ways, I'm speaking to an audience which has made seminal contributions to this literature. But what we succeeded in doing was putting together a lot of evidence, not just at the country level, but at the sector and firm level. And this helped us to tease out the fact that firms that import to export are interestingly different from firms that simply export or only import or do neither. In general, there is compelling evidence that firms that import to export, because of that hyper-specialization, because of close relationships with buyers and sellers, tend to be more productive. And this microeconomic evidence nicely dovetails into macro evidence, which suggests that that transition, breaking into manufacturing from commodity production, is when you get the biggest kick in growth. Subsequent transitions from simple to more advanced manufacturing and services and to innovative activities are also growth generating. But it's that first. So think of Bangladesh, think of Cambodia, and more recently, Ethiopia. These are the stages where you have a big developmental kick. There is one big concern that people like Danny Roderick and others have raised. This is all very well to say that there is growth, but what about jobs? Is it not true, they ask, that firms that participate in global value chains tend to be more and more capital intensive, use machines more and more? And there is a plausible reason why that would be the case, because the precision, the standardization that is required to produce intercompatible parts perhaps can only be achieved by machines and not by clumsy hands. And it turns out to be true that firms that participate in global value chains are in fact more capital intensive than other firms. But there is an interesting aspect. These firms are also more productive. They operate on a larger scale. They're growing faster. And therefore, there are more jobs being generated in these firms. And that really is a central analytical aspect of this report, this result, that any negative substitution effects, the machine taking the place of the worker, are dwarfed by the positive productivity or income effects. I think that's what leads to a generally positive conclusion that these global value chains involve higher productivity, they generate more jobs, and therefore, not surprisingly, the parts of within countries like Vietnam, which have seen greater participation in global value chains, are precisely the parts of those countries which have seen the sharpest reductions in poverty. And this evidence we also are able to replicate in a cross-section of countries, as well as in within countries like Mexico, which also has seen uneven participation in global value chains. And we're beginning to do this work also in other countries. There's one other concern which in a way mirrors the Roderick concern about capital or machinery is robotification. That what do we need to worry about these new technologies? As I said, this twin threat, one is protection and the other is automation. What about automation? What is it doing? And here again we find interestingly the same dynamic as I referred. It's true that a robot replaces many workers, but it also makes firms productive. It increases scale. And we find interestingly that precisely the industries which have seen the greatest robotification, like car production, are the industries which have seen the fastest growth in imports from developing countries of other parts and components which have not been robotified. So for the moment, this is a relatively narrow piece of research, and as I keep saying, I tend to present with great conviction even things that I'm not sure about. So you have to view all this as narrow and initial, as a beginning of a conversation rather than as definitive evidence. But at this stage, technology is more boon than curse. That's the good news. The downside is, first of all, evidence that even though fundamentally global value chains have been a force for international convergence, helping developing countries to grow faster than industrial countries and catch up, and made the world a more equal place, it is possible, and there is evidence, that gains from global value chains are distributed somewhat unequally. When you look at firms from industrial countries, which are often, as my colleague Daria Taglioni reminds me, lead firms, and firms from developing countries, as you look at a country like Japan and a country like India, which have seen increasing participation in global value chains, the markup, which is a measure of the difference between the price at which a firm sells and the cost of its production, is increasing in industrial country firms, but declining in developing country firms. Now, this is not a level comparison. It's how things are changing. And it does raise concern that, now, you see, this can be legitimate. A company like Zara that buys T-shirts from Bangladesh or other countries might be reaping increasing returns to brand name, advertising, innovation in the design. Or it could be that that stage of production is more concentrated. They have more monopsony or monopoly power. And that means that 1,000 Bangladeshi T-shirt producers fiercely competing against each other are reaping relatively fewer benefits. That's one dimension of potential inequality. Within countries, we are all aware that the share of labor is declining relative to the share of capital, and there is some evidence to suggest that global value chains are contributing. It's not surprising. If a firm can threaten to move its production to a lower wage country, it is bargaining more effectively. It is the fact that workers' unions have become progressively weaker and weaker, and there are endogenous institutional changes, endogenous technological changes, and it is conceivable and plausible that global value chains, as with trade in general, are contributing to this diminishing share. Interestingly, there is a gender dimension to this inequality. There is very strong evidence that global value chains favor women's employment. You have seen these pictures of Bangladeshi factories where thousands and thousands of women are making shirts. And that has big development benefits because when women are employed, the children are better nourished and better educated. But there is a glass ceiling. There are relatively few women managers, relatively few women entrepreneurs. So these are the dimensions in which we are seeing increased inequality. There is a dimension which also shows that the ability of the state, the government, to remedy that inequality is also being compromised. Global value chains didn't invent profit shifting or tax competition or relocation of factors. But certainly they contribute to these problems where there are many stages of production. Dubious transfer pricing becomes easier, especially when those stages involve intangibles like intellectual property. And there is evidence that developing countries are big losers in relative terms in terms of revenue. Apart from this concern, there is the environmental, this is one of the most striking pieces of research I've seen recently by Peter Egger and colleagues, showing what has happened to global tax rates. The green shows you the income tax rate of the top 1% of income earners, the blue of corporate tax rate, and you see steep declines in the last decades in 65 economies. The maroon is the tax rate paid by the median worker, the middle class. So this is the double whammy. In industrial countries, the losers from globalization are also bearing a disproportionate burden of taxation. This is Warren Buffett's famous statement that he pays a lower tax than his assistant or driver. I'll come back to this because I see this as one of the central problems we need to address if we are going to sustain openness. On the environmental front, again, it seems relatively obvious that if you're going to have lots of back and forth movement of parts and components, you're going to have more transport and therefore you're going to have more emissions, unless you find cleaner fuels. And similarly, if these parts and components are going to be wrapped up in little pieces of plastic, then you're going to have more waste. Those there is compelling evidence for. The one thing that isn't quite supported by the evidence is what has been referred to as the pollution haven hypothesis. The idea that dirty stages of production are being relocated to countries with weak regulation. That does not seem to be happening, and we can talk about why that's the case. But there is also a positive dimension of global value chains. A firm that's sensitive to how its consumers react to how it produces, whether it's IKEA or Nike, is going to be more committed to ensuring better labor standards, cleaner production, along the whole value chain, even when those stages are located in countries which don't have good standards. It's not to say that these problems will disappear, but they are softened a little bit. And similarly, global value chains are facilitating the production more cheaply and with better quality of a lot of green goods, whether it's solar panels or electric mopeds. But on balance, our assessment is that the environmental dimension is a net concern, and we need to worry about it. Having laid out both a sort of understanding of what their implications are, we look at what determines participation. And here I'm going to now move relatively quickly because I want to focus a little bit more on some dimensions of international cooperation, which I think might be more interesting given where you're located in close proximity to the World Trade Organization. We show that participation is driven by fundamentals, but the fundamentals don't need to shape destiny. Policy choices matter. For example, countries with relatively abundant unskilled labor can attract foreign capital through openness for investment. Countries punished by geography can improve connectivity through open services policies in areas like transport and telecommunication. Countries with a small size needn't be trapped by their own endowments and their own markets. Liberalizing at home and negotiating openness abroad can help them both import the best and realize economies of scale in global markets. And there is scope for institutional improvement also through deep integration, as you've seen in Eastern Europe. We highlight three things that at that first stage, from commodities to manufacturing, and the work in ITC has also shown this, it's reducing trade costs matters profoundly. And not just through trade facilitation, where much has been accomplished through the efforts of the World Trade Organization, but through liberalizing transport services, where very little has been accomplished so far. The next stage, what distinguishes the Cambodias and Bangladeshs of this world from Vietnam, is human capital. Cambodia and Bangladesh are making the same shirts from the same cloth for the last 30 years. There's been very little progression, including in a country like Mexico. But in Vietnam, in Eastern Europe, and China, you see dramatic, what would be called upgrading in participation. And what do these countries that have progressed in common? Broad-based basic skills and human capital, which has made, in a sense, successful and progressive participation possible. I have this one line which I provoked our chief economist with, which is that perhaps the best preparation for a period of inclusive capitalist growth is a period of socialism. Because it's those countries which have seen some of the most dramatic improvements in all dimensions. That final stage to innovation requires deeper institutions which encourage research and development. The part we struggle with, and all institutions struggle with, and this is why this is not a doctrinaire report, is we are confident about what countries should not do, which is create impediments to trade and investment in goods and services. We are much less sure about what the proactive supporting agenda is. What form should industrial policy take? See, conceptually, you can say the state must act to remedy market failure. But there are so many types of market failure, dynamic economies of scale, there's case for infant industry. Where does the state stop? So it's not just the question about the boundaries of the firm. It's a question of the boundaries of the state. And here we have tried to identify examples where proactive policy helps. In dealing with market failure, for example, by ensuring that firms can meet standards and be known to meet standards, that firms can be linked with multinationals. In some cases where broader economy-wide reform is not possible, export processing zones have helped. But again, there are more examples of failed zones than successful zones. How should we think about generalized prescriptions, which might be sensibly conditional on country conditions? This is still a primitive understanding on our part, and I think a really important research agenda. There's some very interesting randomized controlled trials being conducted in Egypt and Pakistan to see how precisely you can promote exports. And this is an agenda where institutions like UNCTAD and ITC have been engaging, but our evidence base is still relatively poor. Then we turn quickly to this question of how we can have greater successful participation in all countries, and emphasize in particular support for labor market adjustment in industrial countries, drawing a contrast between countries like Denmark, which have put in place flex security programs which assist workers during unemployment and help them make transition to better jobs without compromising the flexibility of the labor market, and the relatively, I don't want to say mean, but stingy assistance and excessively narrow assistance, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries. And there is an interesting question we are looking at, whether these systems which are remarkably suited to innovation and growth are poorly suited to convergence, where developing countries catch up and compete with them. We also show, and it will appeal to my colleague and friend from the ILO, that labor standards can be compromised. There are disasters like the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, but programs like the Better Work program, which the ILO and IFC have put in together, can improve working conditions in countries like Vietnam, especially when they're complemented by name and shame disclosure requirements. They have shown significant improvements. But that's not to say that enough is happening. Much more needs to be done. Let me turn the final 3 minutes to, I think, some of the more interesting challenges that international cooperation faces today. This is a chart that I have recently become my favorite chart. The light gray line shows the share of the United Kingdom in international trade. This is a long view of 200 years. The dark black line shows the share of the United States, and the budding orange line shows the share of China. What is interesting is that when you look at the history of the 19th century, you see, all of you have heard about the Opium War. But the horrors of the Opium War have obscured one interesting fact, that when Britain asked China to open up its ports to trade, dominant Britain did not ask for exclusive access to the Chinese market. It said open up to everybody. And that is the most telling example of the 19th century, where dominant Britain, Pax Britannica, was an era of free trade, non-discriminatory imperialism. That commitment began to wobble towards the end of the 19th century, when the Germans and the Americans caught up, and you saw these amazing debates in the British Parliament of how their intellectual property was being stolen by Americans. Slater the traitor was this British man who went off with technology from Lancaster and started mills in the United States, which were seen as cheating and unfair competition. The commitment to openness finally crumbled when Britain's share fell below 10% towards the end of the 1920s, and that's when they reverted to imperial preferences. The amazing coincidence is that after the Second World War, the United States' share in world trade was about 20%. And they became the new pillars of the multilateral trading system, accepting the integration or deeper integration of the European Union without departing mostly from MFN themselves, until Japan threatened to catch up and they reverted to voluntary export restraints, and finally capitulated, I would argue, when by an amazing coincidence, their share in world trade fell below 10%. And that's when the TPP, which you can think of as the modern imperial preferences, were first proposed. The point of this picture is that we are seeing deeper structural change, which threatens the continued openness of the world in a way that could undermine development prospects for developing countries. And this is not an accident of a particular presidency. It's a deeper structural trend. And we need to think harder about how we can preserve openness in these circumstances. One aspect of it is, of course, to deepen traditional cooperation. There are elements of it we have known about, and which is to get rid of barriers, non-tariff barriers in agriculture and services. Other is to deal with tariff escalation, which is the phenomenon that industrial countries impose higher tariffs on chocolates and finished coffee than on cocoa and coffee beans, and therefore inhibit developing country participation in higher ends of value chains. But we also, and most importantly, need to deepen disciplines in areas of legitimate concern about distortions in the Chinese economy, whether it's state-owned enterprises or subsidies. Finally, and most provocatively, the report says that special and differential treatment for large developing countries is largely misplaced. In fact, it is it's become an impediment to successful engagement of developing countries, both in trade and trade negotiations. You can imagine the reaction of our stakeholders like the Indians and the Chinese to this statement. But this, we feel, is an essential part of the new balance that we recommend, which is that large industrial countries stay open and engage constructively on a rules-based way in return for developing countries participating as equals, large developing countries participating as equals, even leaders. But perhaps the most interesting part of the report is that to keep trade open, we need to look beyond trade cooperation. I pointed out to you the big issues in tax rates. Of course, a lot of these tax cuts are driven by ideology, are of vested interests. But we have to accept that in a globalized world where capital and skills are mobile, you need international cooperation to empower the state to deliver what economists have always said, the domestic transfers needed to make globalization a Pareto improvement from which everybody wins. When Danny Roderick or President Trump say that the problem is that countries have ceded or given up too much sovereignty, I would say it's the opposite. That they need to cooperate and give up sovereignty in other areas if they are going to be empowered with the revenue that industrial countries need to help the losers from globalization, and developing countries need to build the infrastructure, hard and soft, for successful globalization. We talk about provocative new ideas like destination-based taxation as offering, with qualification, a way to proceed. We emphasize what UNCTAD did 50 years before us, the need for greater competition policy cooperation to deal with the emergence of these large platforms and large problems of concentration, which might be leading to the kind of high markups and unequal distribution of gains. We talk about data flows, and here we say that there are new ways of thinking about international cooperation, a new approach to dealing with regulatory impediments to trade that we need to consider. Not just the traditional reciprocal liberalization, you open my markets or your markets and I'll open mine. Not even the deeper integration that Richard has written so eloquently about and others, where we think of the European Union mutually recognizing through actions like the Cassis de Dijon and other, or harmonizing their regulation. That's not going to happen in a hugely heterogeneous world. Rather, the most interesting examples now are the privacy shield that the US and EU negotiated, which enables data to flow across the Atlantic, more than any trade agreement. And that is a unique bargain. It's a promise by the exporting country to adhere to the standards of the importing country. And that diagonal bargain could be a central aspect in goods standards and services, from finance to data flows, which are at the heart of global value chains. These kinds of new imaginative approaches to negotiation, plus wider cooperation in areas like taxation and the environment, is necessary for successful and beneficial participation in global value chains. Thank you.
Can I invite the panelists to come, or discussants to come to the podium, table? Okay, well, I'm going to put a few house rules down. Now, just take a seat. I want to make this as participatory as possible. So I'm going to first ask Miriam to provide us with her comments. Miriam. Then we'll go to Richard, and then I will go to Damien. But in between, I'm going to ask not just Aditya to maybe comment if he has immediate comments to make, but also the other discussants if they feel they want to react already to what one of the discussants says. Because very often we have these wonderful presentations, and then we have 3 sets of comments, and then we get one person, the presenter, to come back. So I want to see if we can make this a bit more dynamic. Also, if you have dire request on clarification already when somebody speaks, then please stick up your hand and we will see if we can get you a microphone. But purely for clarification, not questions, because that we can do towards the end. So Miriam, I'm going to give you first the floor.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. Thanks also, Aditya, for this presentation. This report is very close to our heart at the International Trade Center. Our mandate is to help firms to trade, to export and to import. And given that a lot of trade takes place within value chains, we have to deal with value chains in our daily business. We have therefore also been looking at the type of analysis, the kind of work you have been presenting today, and we have done a lot of that with World Bank data. So that may be one of the reasons why many of the findings or some of the messages you have in your report are also messages we have been supporting in our work. I will refer to that, but from a point of view that we typically apply in our work. We work a lot with firms and for firms, and therefore we try to understand how firms think about value chains. And some of the conclusions you presented, we have also drawn from our work by looking at trade through the firm lens. And let me tell 2 stories. The firm lens from the lead firm's point of view, and then the one from the supplier's point of view, the SME point of view. Now, when you think of a lead firm, big multinational, deciding where to buy, from whom to buy, where to invest. In those firms, you typically have an investment department and you have a supply chain management department. What do the people working there think of when they take decisions? They look at the costs of sourcing from somewhere, and for this, the trade policy will matter a lot. And the taxes, the local taxes will matter a lot. They also decide on whether to trade or whether to invest somewhere. So investment policy will matter for them. Now, what this implies is that managers in lead firms will look at trade policy, investment policy, and taxation policy together. And this is something that national policymakers typically don't do. You have a ministry for trade, you have a ministry that deals with investment. Increasingly, these are packaged now maybe in the same place, but taxes, that's the finance ministry. You're not going to touch that when you deal with trade. And we see that also reflected in what happens at the international level. We have a multilateral trading system. We have now increasingly discussions at the international level on investment, including now at the WTO, investment facilitation, and at the G20, trade and investment are being discussed together within one working group. Taxation is discussed somewhere else. Taxation not directly taken into account in trade agreements. They are marginally, but I'm not going to enter that. And taxation, as you mentioned, Aditya, until very recently, not a lot of multilateral collaboration. So based on that type of analysis, we also argued in a report we published in 2017, SME Competitiveness Outlook of the Year, that there's more need for more international collaboration on taxes, more multilateralism rather than less, and therefore the finding you present on a global world, an open world needs more collaboration, more work together on taxes. We fully support that idea. It is my impression that the industrialized world has definitely taken that agenda, that problem on board since the financial crisis. And if you go to New York and listen to issues around taxation, you hear a lot about illicit financial flows. It's a major concern for developing countries. This topic is important, and I can only encourage young researchers to look at the work you presented by Peter Egger, to look at the work that Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Sanz and Saiz and others are doing on the interface between globalization and taxation. Now, I said we look at things through the lens of the lead firm. We also look at things through the lens of the SME. Now, an SME would often like to connect to a value chain, would like to talk to that supply chain manager that I've just been mentioning. So one of the things we do at ITC is to try to understand what the value chain looks like from an SME point of view. So we provide guidance to small and medium-sized enterprises to help them understand how they can position themselves well, to talk to supply chain managers, and to position themselves within a value chain and maybe to move up within the value chain. Now, standards, and you have mentioned them in your presentation, Aditya, are crucial for this. SMEs often have to show that they meet certain accounting standards, that they meet certain logistics standards, that they meet standards in the production of what they actually sell, be it in textiles, being in machinery, in cars, anywhere. Standards are crucial. And the whole system around meeting standards, controlling standards, certifying standards is crucial. Now, that's a system that most trade economists don't understand. And where the kind of issues you mentioned on competition policy may matter too. I invite all of you to look at the setup of the certification industry. I think it's highly concentrated, and that it has then cost affects SMEs through the costs they have to pay for this. I would like to finish that particular point referring to something else, the contractual relationship between the SME and the lead firm. Often small and medium-sized enterprises do not know how to negotiate with a supply chain manager. They don't know what to write in the contract. And if they set up a bad contract, any changes may end up, any risks involved in the relationship may be passed over to the SME. If suddenly the color of the T-shirt changes from red to blue, SME, the supplier has to adjust. The size, the most sold size changes, supplier has to adjust. If the supplier hasn't protected him or herself against this in the contractual arrangement, hasn't built buffers into the financing of the production, guess what happens? The supplier passes the cost of that risk on to workers. And I mean to have seen research from the ILO saying exactly this. The weakness of SMEs and their weakness in setting up clever contractual relationships is often the source of a negative effect of this kind of relationships then on workers. The employer passes the risk on to the worker. I will finish by referring to the 2 points that I will remember from your intervention, most remember from your intervention, Aditya, because they struck me as being unusual. First, you say, when it comes to the environmental dimension of global value chains, we believe that there is reason for concern, that maybe the balance is rather on the negative side. That's a political decision you took to make that statement, I would expect, that has implications for our work on environment and trade. I would be very happy to hear more about this. It's an important statement that we will definitely look into more at ITC. The second, I'm not sure whether I got that quote exactly, is the one of your provocation to your chief economist when you favored a period of socialism after the period we have seen now. I would like to relate that provocation to this chart you showed about the period in which the UK became nervous about globalization and the US now is becoming nervous about globalization. Not only in the early 20th centuries did the share of exports of the UK decline, the level of inequality in a country like the UK was very high. And the same thing is happening currently in many economies. So when this happens, a lot of globalization, share of exports declines, high level of inequality, and Mr. Warren Buffett pays lower taxes than his assistant, that's when people start to be concerned about globalization, and that's when people start, and voters start to oppose it. And therefore, I believe that your taxation agenda is also related to your chart about us having to be concerned about the end of openness. I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I pass the mic on to Aditya.
Aditya, do you want to? No, you don't want to react immediately? Anybody from the floor has a burning question on the issues that Marion raised? No? Then we go to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to be fairly short because I find the Q&A in these things pretty interesting. And of course, I'm going to be talking about my book. Mr. Chairman, did I mention I have a book?
No.
No? Okay. So, yeah, exactly. It's about globalization. No, never mind. So I like this report and I will use it in teaching and in talking to policymakers. I think it's a very balanced approach. And it's one that we haven't, I think we're moving towards it in many of the international organizations, where you're not an advocate or a cheerleader, but rather much more sober discussion of globalization. I like very much this rich set of stylized facts that emerge with great charts. I'm going to try and get that PowerPoint presentation and use it. And I think those rich set of stylized facts will spark a lot of thinking, a deeper, broader thinking about global value chains and emerging markets. When I run around the world and talk to people about global value chains, I think there's some stereotypes in their minds. It's the auto industry, it's Thailand, basically, kind of things like that, or Mexico. And I like the fact that you broaden out and you talk about all sorts of different and all sorts of industries, global value chains. And I like that very, very much. Also, the pros and the cons of global value chain participation, I think, are laid out very plainly. Although if I had to quibble with it, it would be, what's the alternative? So it's somewhat difficult to say that these pros and cons are happening because of global value chain participation that wouldn't have happened if it had been plain old trade. So there may be some connectedness there that needs teasing out. But there's no doubt that we're beyond the world where you just say global value chains are great for development, great for equality, a little bit bad for the environment, but what do you want? It's all laid out, and I like that very much. It's a report that's hopeful and helpful, but sober. And I like the punchline that thinking about global value chains needs a lot more joined up thinking. And you were saying some of this stuff too on taxation, labor standards, environment, the complementary domestic policies to deal with the fallout, the preparatory policies you need to make sure you participate well. And so I like that very much. Just to sort of rephrase your thing about your teasing the chief economist, what I said is that Marx had it just wrong. Marx had a sequence where capitalism prepares the ground for socialism and communism. As it turned out, de facto, it was exactly the other way around. And I just can't wait till Cuba frees up. I'm sure we'll see another China there or another Vietnam in the coming years. Partly because, education, roads, healthcare, those were some basic things that at least some of those governments put in place, and that's what allowed to take off. Okay, now what I'd like to do is push this a little bit further in the direction of services, which is my latest thing that I'm fascinated with. I've been writing about global value chains for about 15 years in manufacturing, and now I'd like to switch over more to services. So let me start with a provocative thought experiment. Digital technology will automate manufacturing, and manufacturing will become jobless, and therefore largely non-traded. But The same technology will make services freely traded. So in the world of development, endless development strategies based on moving people from the farms to the factories with little education are not going to work one way or another. Now, we don't know if that's going to happen in 10 years or in 20 years, but, and it's already happened in some industries, but that's the drift. So I think it's worthwhile looking at services, not just manufacturing, and their service value chains are very important, because one of the things that digital technology has done is disintegrate the verticality of service provisions that used to dominate service provisions, all done in the same building. In the insurance services were provided by people sitting in a building, all working for the same firm together, often because of informational problems. And digital technology has allowed that to disintegrate, and there's now lots of outsourcing and offshoring and automation of that. So just to sort of give some of the thoughts that I had, and I would like to hear your reaction to, is that in essence, I think these new development strategies, service-led development strategies, not manufacturing-led development strategies, will have to focus on cities, services, and training, not factories, equipment, and technology. And that it will require kind of a change in a mindset that people start to think more like the Philippines has been thinking about development than countries like Vietnam or Thailand have been thinking about it. So those are just some. I also very much agree with the taxation and the labor standards. Now that's an old issue in global value chains, and there's an argument that it might have made it better. But when it comes to service value chains, there is no regulation, there's no way of checking, and I suspect that the people aren't paying taxes when they're providing services internationally, probably not respecting even the basic labor rights, and we don't even know how to enforce those things. So I think that's another line to push. So I would like your reaction as to whether these messages also apply to service value chains.
Should I assume, Aditya, that you prefer to hear first Damien as well?
I think it might be. I'm dying to talk, but I would rather. Okay.
Any immediate questions to the professor from the floor? Then we go to Damien, another professor.
Well, X.
You never lose the title.
No? Oh, really? Oh, that's good to know. That's good. Thanks for that. It's been a double good reason to come. Thanks for the chance to discuss the report. I want to start by saying that the report is hugely rich. I mean, it's not just rich, it's hugely rich. And it's a very nuanced report. I think you've only got it's a great presentation from Aditya. But the summary, I think, wants to say that global value chains, they're delivering this double dividend at a global level, that they're allowing firms and countries to specialize in tasks that they're best at doing. And it is this sort of hyper-specialization. And it's also allowing firms to gain from connections, and here I'm reading from the report, with foreign firms, which pass on the best managerial and technological practices. So countries enjoy faster income growth and productivity. That's a summary statement. The report is far more nuanced, and as a result, interesting, I think, in the same way that the presentation was. So there are many, many dimensions to this report. So it's really fascinating reading. I want to just focus, I think, on the issue that perhaps, we're all sort of worried about, not only the ILO, I think all the sort of United Nations and beyond. We're all worried about inequality. We're worried about a sense of injustice. And the report worries about this too, especially chapters 3, 8, and various other parts to do with the green economy and technology and so on. And it makes for very interesting reading. So there's a really strong focus on getting the distribution of gains right. So although we've got these grand summary statements about what global value chains bring to the world, that's it's a sort of an average, if you like, as the forthcoming Human Development Report is going to say. So we need to get beyond averages if we're going to tackle social injustice in the world, because social injustice doesn't spring from average concerns. It springs from problems of distribution of incomes and so on. So while our research at the ILO would agree very much that those firms engaged in global value chains generally, on average, do better in terms of productivity and wages and skills and so on than those firms that don't in that particular country. There is a problem, nevertheless, of the overall distribution. So it seems, and I think the report is saying this between the lines, that those firms could do even better. So the markup, which is the phrase used throughout the report, other people would refer to that as the rent, those markups are going to the large international firms in developed countries, and the report worries about this. So it talks about the risk that firms from developing countries experience limited profits after becoming suppliers for global firms, and that mirrors, in fact, the rise in profits in developed countries. So one of the graphs that Aditya showed this, with markups going up in developed country for the leading firms and down in developing countries, even though those markups and the productivity gains and income may still be better than other domestic-owned firms that are in global value chains. So, but it's nevertheless a problem because we know that income gains in low-income countries have slowed down, have stagnated altogether. So there are still big gains among middle-income countries, but the low-income countries need looking at, and we need policy reform urgently. So the question that was posed at the beginning of the presentation was, how should countries participate in global value chains? And here is where I have not exactly an issue with the report, because the report's fantastic, but how one might bring in another set of literature. There's a very interesting literature, I think, I come from a management literature background, in the world of management, as well as geography. Geographers are doing, I think, all the really kind of interesting work in global value chains, I would say. As a kind of an economist, I would say that. They really get into the sector, and they really get into the business enterprise. So I think I'm going to mirror your remarks a little bit. I think, the old black box of the firm really does need to be opened up in the global value chain. So we shouldn't be talking anymore about the global chain, or nevertheless, or even the average global value chain. A paper I recently had the good fortune to review talked about 3 different types of global value chains. And this, I think, allows us to think about these distribution effects. So one is the sort of win-win situation, and these authors, Anne Postuma and Gerhard Reinecke, both ILO officials out in South America, they call that more integrated upgrading, where lead firms are doing all the things one wants a lead firm to do. They're sharing HR practices about training and work and safe workplaces and so on. They're sharing technologies, so technological upgrading is shared and diffused in a proper way, as well as wages and so on. So and they're the kind of examples that are really highlighted throughout the report. And we need to know those examples because that tells other firms and other sectors and other countries how to make this kind of win-win situation. However, there are other types of global value chains, and this does relate to the business strategy, the organizational capabilities, as well as host country institutions. So one can't lay the blame in any one particular area. It's a complex analysis. And they call that truncated development, where lead firms are precisely not passing on their technologies and their skills and so on. There is a reference in the report to the mining sector, where there are concerns of perhaps intellectual property and other concerns. And that is, in fact, a global value chain sector where you don't see very much passing on of knowledge, technologies, and gains and so on, and a real unequal distribution of markups or rents. But there's also another area, which is called oppositional development. And here you might find that the lead firms are sharing with their lead suppliers, but it doesn't go any further. And there we have problems in the data, because often with a lot of this data, we're picking up only what's happening between the lead firm and the first-tier suppliers, and we're missing many of the other rungs, especially because way further down the suppliers, a lot of ILO research shows we get into the informal sector, we get into homework, and lots of other areas where it becomes very difficult to talk about inter-firm relations. So, to cut a long story short, we need to know more about these relational characteristics of global value chains, and there is a literature out there. And I think we can do a lot to start thinking about different types of global value chain, right? So it's not a single global value chain, and it's not a single average result of global value chains. Different things are happening in different places, and this is why we have, I think, popular concerns about social injustice and the very evident concerns about inequalities of all types. So I'll have other things to say as well about the green issues and technology issues, but I'll keep my comments for that. Thanks.
Well, Aditya, I'm not going to say which questions you should answer, but I heard comments around, collaboration, around taxation. I know you will like that one. I heard comments about our global value chains in manufacturing similar as they would be in services, or is there a different way of collaborating there? I heard people again talking about your sequencing. Is it socialism first, then capitalism, or do we have capitalism first and then socialism, or where are we going there? Maybe that can be a more philosophical answer, but maybe we need a different panel for that. And then I heard also again about inequality issues. How do we manage those? I mean, I hear Damien talk about the different types of distributional effects. How do they occur? How do lead firms actually collaborate with along the value chain? They're very interesting issues, and I'm sure you will have lots of interesting answers to give to us. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. You heard all those things. I only heard how good the report was. No, I'm
planning to for the summing up,
No, I am very grateful to all of you. You've, I think you've been generous, but I'm also relieved and happy that you see the report for what it is. It consolidates a lot of research, it pushes things a little further, and it opens up a conversation. So everything that you are curious about, I'm curious about, and I think it will be a shared exploration and conversation. I'll say three things, and then it'd be interesting. You people have to pay the tax of being here by participating. You can't stay quiet. So let me just say that I think on Marion's point, it's not a political judgment. I think there is fundamentally a tension between growth and the environment. And if that global value chains are going to have hyper-specialization, there's therefore more trade, more transport, there is going to be higher growth in incomes. And if that production and consumption is not clean, there is an inevitable tension with the environment. And that's why I think the answer to that is not to, I think maybe that is a question that either you said or Richard said. I think the solution is a stronger complementary policies action. And now, we speak in the report about both the desirability of carbon taxes and of stricter environmental regulation. So I think in that case, of course, there are bigger questions about efficiency and equity, but there are interesting, innovative. There is Arik Levinson at the Georgetown University who helped us in writing this thing. There are very interesting new ideas about how you might reimburse the revenue from a carbon tax, both to firms as a production subsidy to soften the adverse effects on their competitiveness, and to households as a consumption subsidy to soften the concerns about poverty and inequality of higher prices of essential goods. But these are ways in which you can overcome the political resistance. But there is a broader public good problem associated with action on the environment, and that, again, is accentuated by the fact that the United States is turning its back on all forms of cooperation. I think I should say on the socialism, communism, I think Richard has a gift for being able to put things much more crisply than anybody else. It's precisely what he said, the sequence. I wasn't saying that we're all headed for socialism, but I'm saying those who happened to have socialism thrust on them or turned out to be remarkably well positioned to take advantage of capitalist growth opportunities. They had broad-based access to education, human capital. Think of Eastern Europe, think of China, Vietnam. I had somebody from China, one of their leading scholars, talking about what have we learned from China's poverty reduction. And he said it's all about growth. It isn't about anything else. It's trickle-down growth. But I think, and this is the point that I made to him, it's trickled down precisely because of the initial conditions. And this used to be the point that people made about South Korea, that because the landowners were all Japanese and left, land reform made South Korea a much more equal place before its transition to growth. And that made it much more participative. Richard, again, somebody says that all empirical economics is economic history because you rely on data and you rely on the past. Richard has become a futurist. and therefore he's seeing, I think, brilliantly, I think precisely what is happening in services. We have a focus on services, but it's a somewhat pedestrian focus on services. It's relying on the weak existing data. I have a chart which says exactly what Richard did, that the fragmentation we are seeing in production is not just services like accounting and design being liberated from the confines of a factory. It's fragmentation of services themselves. You know, when you went into a hospital, everything happened within the building. Now it's happening all over the world, the accounting, the diagnostics, and so on. And the same technologies which are creating worries about automation, about displacement, are also remarkably improving connectivity. I think Richard has these vivid pictures of hologrammed software providers jumping over immigration restrictions and providing services all over the world. But even translation software, there is already good empirical evidence, is dramatically increasing trade and services between Latin America and the United States. But it is a challenge, and it is really important to think about it. You know, Philippines is one of the tired tigers of East Asia. It's not as if services have proved to be a dynamic engine of growth. India is a country which has successfully distorted its own comparative advantage by the rigidities in its labor market, capital market, credit markets, and relied on services. And here I think Danny Roderick's point we all need to think harder about is the simple point that supposing you had labor intensity on one axis and tradability on another, what would that line look like? And that is a legitimate worry. If it is true that the tradable are relatively labor scarce or less labor intensive, then can we expect this new paradigm of international trade, which is a powerful idea that manufacturing becomes less tradable and services tradable? How do we see this translating into the same powerful kick to development that came from a transition from commodities to manufacturing, especially if you have a dysfunctional educational system, the skill system? And that is an attribute of even the heroes of the manufacturing revolution. You know, when you look at Southeast Asia, look at even the heroes of the services revolution, like India, they're just not generating the kind of skills that you need on a scale that would, you know, fundamentally, in a way, change your comparative advantage so that you are not a low-skill, labor-intensive country or endowed country. Finally, Damien, I think your very nice points and how to think about these different ways of participating. And we try in the report, and you know, people like Gary Gareffi and others have done great work, which is precisely the kind of work you're talking about, detailing experience with different types of arrangements with deed firms. We're also seeing this other big change, which is, and Gary Gareffi said this, that first it was distribution firms that went looking for, no, first manufacturers went looking for value chains. BMW invested and started value chains. Then Walmart and JCPenney, distributors, went looking for value chains. The most interesting development is the development of the platform. The platform itself, I heard Richard saying this and we've been thinking about it, is in a way providing lots of bundles of services, from advertising to transacting to payment to delivery to logistics. And it's becoming a new entity, a highly concentrated entity. And therefore understanding, is it as conducive to the flows of technology and that old arrangements such as manufacturing-led things were, or less so? Are these relationships that Amazon establishes with suppliers also facilitating productivity growth and diffusion of technology? How much monopsony power, how much monopoly power? So that's the other dimension of this new services world. The entities like Uber, Amazon, Airbnb, FinTech, WhatsApp, you know, all these things are transforming traditional services markets. And if I can just leave you with one idea which we are looking at. You see, we think of these platforms as offering remarkable opportunities, remarkable connectivity. You know, people think of small and medium enterprises breaking out of their local markets and selling to the whole world. But these platforms are at a phase where they are subsidizing their sales. They're trying to win consumers. Amazon makes money from its cloud computing, not so much from its distribution. Flipkart in India undersells products to win over consumers and lock them in. So in effect, then you look at what are they selling and where are those things produced. Now, they don't say, but you can look at trade data. And most of what they're selling are consumer goods made in China. The Indian good is the sari. The African good is a tribal sculpture. So the standardized scale is, in a way, the platform could be magnifying the China shock and in a way inhibiting the possibility of new entry in sectors. I think those kinds of perverse elements, I'm not saying that's happening, but are the kind of things we need to understand better to see how these value chains are evolving. And let me now open it up to you.
Yes. I think we have time for a few questions. Who wants to start? The first ones are always the difficult, getting over the threshold, and then normally we get a waterfall.
Just ask for the second question.
Yes, ask for the second question.
Do you have a first update?
Yes. Who wants to come up with the second question so we can bring the microphone there?
Hi, thank you very much for that presentation. My name is Caesar. I'm a master's student here at the Graduate Institute. And I wanted to talk or ask about this notion of marginal product of capital and the idea of low productivity levels in developing countries and how that inhibits firms from truly becoming large players as far as global value chains are concerned. And my understanding is that this low productivity is usually due to social and technical inefficiencies in these developing countries. I was wondering if any member of the panel could speak to what the biggest social or technical inefficiencies currently are in developing countries, limiting firms from growing to the point where they can become, big players or, very productive players in the global value chain. And specifically to Professor Baldwin, how this also relates to the services sector. Does this shift towards the services trade fix, well, not fix, because that's a big word, but improve this productivity issue around the marginal product of capital? Thanks.
Second question. Okay, my prediction, all the way up there. Otherwise, my prediction of getting a waterfall after the first question is not going to come out, no?
Jacques Markovich, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Thank you so much for such a bright presentation and for your report. I have one question, and then I will ask to Professor Baldwin a comment on the Philippines, since he mentioned that the Philippines are on the right way. Regarding the report, my question is, beside academia and economists, who should be the reader of your reports? When we see what is happening in Latin America, with government representing states so much short-time oriented, and even business community short-time oriented, we see NGOs absolutely engaged in environmental and social issues. Who do you see as the should be the readers of your report so we can make the changes that you are proposing to integrate the economies and the actors in the global value chains?
Thank you very much. Yes. About IPR, about intellectual property rights, as you mentioned, systems, because IPR are based on law and management. And if you are talking, if I heard you, intellectual properties, I don't know if you was thinking which is IPR, which is patent, trademark, copyright, industrial design, and geographical indications, or other issues what we are living nowadays, which is new technologies. And Nowadays, any new idea, patent, it could be a company, SMEs, and International Trade Center managing food. Important in the SMEs, they are leaders since 2004. And the challenge nowadays is also for health and healthcare and access for health. What I want to, if you can share with me, or if you are agree with what I want to raise, taxations. I appreciate what Mrs. Marion, she said. Yes, because in intellectual properties rights systems, sometimes you are talking about license, and later, and it could be access, and later it will royalties and various finance transactions, which is also right. But it could be also taxes. But nowadays the challenge is data and big data and access to data and sensible data and access for health, public health. Do you think that, or which is the challenge, data is not really intellectual properties and could be commodities? But for whom and who can control? Thank you.
Well, I see no hands anymore, so we can go back to the panel. I also, because I noticed that we are running out of time, but I want to give everybody a chance to make some comments. And maybe if I can ask the panel also to think about what's next with this report. We heard already what's the audience, but what would be maybe one of your research questions you want Aditya to take back home to Washington to say, this is what the banks could really be helping.
Something that we should all work on together.
Yeah, or something we also work on together. But you know, what would they love to see next from the bank on issues around global value chain? Who wants to start? Damien?
Well, I have a question for us all to work on. It picks up really on what you were just saying. So the question is the digital platform a global value chain? I mean, it might be, it might not be, it might be something quite different. And these are global value chains, not only the Ubers and so on that were distributing, work that we see, but also the invisible work, the so-called micro-task work of Mechanical Turk and so on, which they're very interesting global value chains, if that's what we want to call them. But we might come up with a new word, who knows? So that I'm very interested in that, and I'm glad you raised that. I think most of the questions were addressed to you. Just to answer quickly on the low productivity and what are the social and technical competencies, I think within the context of this report, the way I see that is to really think about what's the relationship between the different firms, different enterprises in a global value chain, in a trading relationship, inputs, outputs, and so on. And how do you understand those business connections as contributing to productivity? So it's not really a question of the social and technical competences within a firm. It's to do with the relation as well. So I think a lot of what happens within firms depends on the wider network, which is what makes global value chains such a fascinating topic, especially because they cross country and sector boundaries. I'll leave it at that because of time. Thanks.
Maybe I take your invitation and the question from the left on who should read this report. We will definitely at ITC read it in detail and take every little thing out of it that we will find useful, and I'm sure there will be a lot for the better design of our technical assistance in the field to help companies connect to value chains. I hope researchers, in particular the younger ones, read this and will find inspiration for their future work. And I think that work on the link between trade and taxation, on the link between trade and environment, and on the linkages between trade and firms. I'm thinking here of an increased research on the interface between trade and maybe it's I/O, where we analyze how firms act and how that plays out at the macro level. I think there that would be very useful for us to drive policy work in the future. So ITC will read this. I hope students, researchers read it, and I do hope people in finance ministries read it, and that these people start to talk to their colleagues in the ministry that deals with trade and or investment.
Well, I'll just repeat the call for services, and many of you will know that while I was fascinating on GVCs in manufacturing in the 2000s, you were writing about services. So this is a kind of convenient switching of hats here. I don't think I'm pushing too hard to get you to think more hard about services. And to talk a little bit about development, I think one way to think about service exports from developing countries in a relatively abstract way, and abstract doesn't go very far in development, but at least you have to start that way, is that basically it's allowing developing countries to exploit their true comparative advantage, which is quality-adjusted, low-cost labor, but without having to first build a good and then export the good. So it's rather direct export of the true comparative advantage. And therefore, I think in principle, it will allow the emerging market miracle to spread, because the hindrances of having to have factories and ports and be parts of clusters has kept a lot of countries from participating in the global value chain revolution. Whereas in services, it will be much more dispersed, I think. And we have a few examples, but just going through. I also have to say that I've just started writing and thinking about service-led manufacturing. I have one paper. So I've actually done a lot more writing than thinking, which is a dangerous place to be, but very exciting, actually. So I can't talk in detail about what Philippines should or shouldn't do, but I must say they've had a very different development experience than many other countries, and it's interesting to learn from it. And when you read about it, it's almost like that was a mistake, or isn't it curious that we started exporting so much in services, and we've been focusing, trying to get our manufacturing sector work, and that won't work, but these guys in services somehow exported it. So I don't know if I answered all those questions. The IPR, I don't have any answer to that. It's just a lot of the examples I've seen, it's just tricks and tips in factories and HR and to get people to show up on time and put their tools away. And it's little things like that the cooperation in the global value chain has brought up the productivity of SMEs in developing countries. And that I think it's not really written down IPR, but it's know-how that's important to advance. So it's not really IPR in that sense, in a formal sense.
I think, thank you very much. All these questions are thoughtful, and there is no clear, definite answer. I think the kind of inefficiencies in developing countries, I think, as Richard said, sometimes, when you think of India's success in services, it's as much a consequence of its failure in manufacturing. There is a rigid labor market where it's very hard to hire and fire workers above a certain size. It's very hard to acquire land. It's very hard. The institutions that govern goods trade are really not efficient and corrupt, like customs. But in services, the market for skills is relatively flexible. That the institutions that regulate services are, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, the Reserve Bank of India, NASSCOM. These are both public and private sector institutions which are very well developed. Even connectivity, it's taken India a long time to build ports and roads, but telecommunications infrastructure, where they opened up and liberalized, has grown much faster. So trade costs, endowments, institutions have perversely developed. And Philippines is similar in a way. But maybe there are, as Richard says, certain cycles. There was a period where you could jump on the manufacturing wave, and it led to great achievements. And there are some who missed that crest. Maybe their time will come in a different way. But I think one thing is true of services, and people have talked about how much do we care about consumer preferences and regulation. I think it is true that there is going to be a lot of spontaneous trading in services. But my sense is that, even though there are these new technologies and business models, they're developing new ways of addressing market failure as well. In a way, they're replacing the traditional regulator, because Amazon is doing more to ensure consumer satisfaction than the traditional retail shop. It's, I return things to Amazon and they say, I want to return it. They say, don't worry, we'll reimburse the money if you're not satisfied, but keep the product. So there is really interesting in fintech, people worry about what it'll do to financial stability, but it's improving access dramatically. You've seen what it's doing to Kenya. So I think striking the regulatory balance nationally, but also finding ways of cooperating internationally, as when I mentioned the data flows issue, are going to be different. It's not just openness is there already for a lot of digital trade, but how do you prevent regulatory barriers from emerging? How do you prevent developing countries from becoming marginalized as industrial countries, trade on the basis of mutual trust rather than comparative advantage? I think that question of how much will regulation become redundant, so inherent comparative advantage will drive trade, and how much will regulation become an impediment, and how much will there need to be new regulation to ensure concentration, for example, in the platforms, doesn't become a barrier, or to how the gains are distributed. I think these are the kind of questions that are really important. I hope everybody will read the report. It's written in a way that is accessible and readable, especially the overview. We spent a long time on that. But Richard has said something important to me. We have to rely more on, we moved from words to graphs. We have to move from graphs to pictures, and from pictures to movies. So maybe make these things really accessible and understandable. And the final point, I think you're right about intellectual property rights. And China is a great example. The bank did a report about looking at diffusion and discovery. And somebody said, isn't China great that they have these fuzzy property rights or intellectual property? But those fuzzy property rights are perhaps excellent for diffusion, but not so good for discovery. So how you strike a balance between access through, say, compulsory licensing, but innovation through assured returns to discovery, I think it's a big question. In global value chains, it's playing itself out as, how are the gains distributed? And especially in the area of taxation, it's made location so, how should I say, fungible, that it's posed, I think, profound problems for taxation. I think it's that intellectual property component of global value chains that I think is one of the biggest reasons for tax evasion and tax avoidance. And thinking about how those gains are distributed more equally is important. But I don't want to have the last word, but I'm really grateful to my discussants for engaging so thoughtfully in a big and sometimes tedious report. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have come to the end. I want to thank Damien, Miriam, Richard for their wonderful comments, insightful comments, and of course Aditya for his presentation, and the audience for not going to the toilet event next door, although it sounded also very interesting, as Aditya pointed out to us. Also, I want to maybe let you know that next year, when we gather again to discuss the World Development Report, it will actually be about data issues. So the bank has decided to look at data issues, data flows, and how they are affecting development in general. And the concept note, for some of us who want to see it, will probably come out relatively soon, I expect. And then a year from now, we can gather here to discuss issues around data and how it affects development. Thank you very much.